much for joining us on this session this morning on effective open data, user-centred, joined up and interoperable. My name is Fiona Smith and I'm from the Open Data Institute based in London. It's my pleasure to host you here this morning. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers representing different fields including government, open data, agriculture research and civic tech. And during this session we will be drawing upon 3 current research initiatives in open data and agriculture. The first of those is the Open Data Charter's Agriculture Sector Package. The second is the Initiative for Open Agriculture Funding. And the third is a research project of the Data Rights and Responsibility Group. And between all of these projects, they're seeking to understand fundamental issues relating to the data infrastructure for agriculture. Looking at questions like, how do we understand user needs? How can we improve data interoperability? And how do we refine the agriculture funding data standards? And what connects all of these different projects is really that bigger question about what is the data infrastructure, what's the ecosystem behind that we need to feed the planet as we tackle some of those global challenges we heard about in the plenary this morning. At the ODI, we talk a lot about this notion of data as infrastructure. And when we talk about it in that sense, we're referring to the data assets. That means what are the different data sets that we need to answer questions, like how many of the world's poor are going hungry every night. But the other crucial factors to consider are what are the organisations within the ecosystem that are currently collecting and managing that data that we need. And the third very important piece is around what are the governance systems that sort of dictate and help us navigate how to use and manage that data, especially as we consider issues like data and digital literacy and inequality gaps. So with the introduction underway, it is my pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers here this morning, who will be introducing the Agriculture Sector Package. So it's my honour to welcome Andre Leperrier, who is Executive Director of the GODAN initiative. He will be followed by Andre Guillermo to my left, who is an independent consultant and lead researcher of the Agriculture Sector Package. We'll be presenting about current findings and inviting you all to participate within that process. Now, so each of these projects are going to introduce their project with a series of quick presentations. At the end of those presentations, I'll then open it up to the audience for any clarifying questions. So please hold on to your questions for now, and when we get to the end, we'll give you space to interject with questions or comments. So without further ado, Andre.
I'm very glad to be here this morning. Professionally, of course, because GODAN has been very much involved for quite some time working with ODI on preparing this package, which I think is very important. And also personally, I'm happy to be here because the subject is very dear to my heart as well. The whole concept of the agriculture package, as we refer to sometimes, came from the idea of creating some kind of a toolkit, putting together some kind of an instrument that would be made available to governments that are very much motivated, oriented towards stimulating agriculture in their country using open data. So we thought, you know, a lot of people agree with the concept, but they're not really sure how to go with it. So if we were to prepare some kind of a toolkit that they could use, it would certainly go a long way. So that's how the idea came up. So for this, the team that has been working on it is going to expand much more, but I will just introduce a few things having to do with this concept, and then I'll give the floor to those that have been more technically involved in preparing it than me. So the ag sector package is basically is many things, but you have to think of it as not a universe, but some kind of an entity in which you have resources, especially in pertaining to the data. You have curated resources, you have key data sets. You know, nowadays I was asked not long ago, how many open data sets are there available nowadays? And in a quick calculation, we'll reach almost 500,000 data sets of all kinds related in one way or another to agriculture available now. So, but they're not equally important, they're not equally relevant, and then, well, so we thought if there could be an environment where the key ones, those that really make sense, are useful and can help policymakers make a difference, can be stored or can be accessed from, that would be the right way. And then if we can help them elaborate key standards in relation to these data sets and the way to implement them, that would also be very good, especially if we facilitate that be translated in policies. Because oftentimes that's where the gap is. You have data over here and you have the policymakers over there, but the link between the two doesn't quite happen for all kinds of reasons, because data is often very raw, very difficult to understand, very difficult to transpose into the reality of the field. So this ag package hopefully will contribute to bridge that gap. So, wow, so technology is really, so, well, no, I'm not even sure what it was. Okay, well, anyway, our role in this is, as you know, GODAN is composed of many different entities, government, private sector, research institutions, civil society, and whatnot. I think all of them have a certain role to play in relation to the ag sector package, either as beneficiaries or as drivers dealing with their governments and defining the proper policies. Meanwhile, we see that more and more governments are joining ODC. They're seeking support and are open, I guess, to being advised and help on that. So therefore, we hope that they will see the open data sector packages, including the ag sector package, as an opportunity, as a tool that is good for them to use. We just had a couple examples of some governments that already have started to do a number of interesting things using open data to define policies, to put in place an environment that will allow people to benefit from the use of open data in their day-to-day life, especially in the ag sector. We have examples of Brazil. So an example of open data is that in Brazil, it was found releasing nutrition-related data that there's a wealth of wild fruits that people use locally, they like it, that turned out to be much higher in nutritional content than the commercial fruits you buy at the grocery store. So now a lot of entities, companies are trying to see what would be the best way to cultivate and harvest those, possibly to export as well, so that not only the world would benefit in terms of nutrition, but also the Brazilian economy would as well, exploring this new avenue thanks to open data. But one that I like a lot, maybe because I lived and worked there for some time, is in Ethiopia, where they wanted to extend to expand the ag extension and to reach out more little farmers. And as you know, Ethiopia is a very big country, so some are very far, so it's not easy to reach people, to go and help them, advise them as to how they can improve their productivity in their little farm. So in 2014, if I recall right, they developed a hotline. But this hotline is designed especially for small farmers, where they can, whenever they face a difficulty or they have a question in terms of managing their yields, their crops, they can just call and then they get advice. To give you an idea, in the first 3 months that this hotline was implemented, this hotline received 1.5 million calls. 1.5 million, that's 500,000 calls per month of farmers that were seeking advice. So that's where open data in the right environment, supported by the governments, can make a difference. So in this, I'll give the floor to my colleagues, which will go deeper in the subject. So André, to you, André.
Thank you, Andre. So, ladies and gentlemen, getting to the core of the agricultural sector package, so defining key data sets in agriculture, their standards, policy recommendations to governments, is not an easy job. And why is it not an easy job? I think you all know that agriculture is incredibly diverse. The slide is demonstrating that not only agriculture is diverse, farmers are diverse. There are investment farmers, smallholder farmers, part-time farmers, family farmers, they all have their own data needs. And contributing to food security with data is not only providing data to the farmers, but also to other stakeholders. I'm thinking of input suppliers, processors, transporters, financial service providers, but also the government themselves. The agriculture sector package is coming from the Open Data Charter, which is focused on government. So, but even governments are diverse. Just to illustrate that the government can be very centralized and planning into detail their interventions, so that they can have a more liberal approach to realize their objectives. So what to recommend in the agricultural sector package? And then at last, the countries themselves are diverse. There are different biofiscal challenges, different socioeconomic challenges. Different socioeconomic challenges. Different institutes, different cultures. So how to go about this complexity? So what is our approach? So first of all, we want to strongly focus the agriculture sector package on arable farming. This is just the first version. It's a living document and it will be expanded. So, but having a clear focus on one of the major forms of agriculture on the world will at least restrict it. And we have an impact and user-centered approach. So we want to get to the data sets that can really make an impact and understand how the data is will be used in practice by the different data users to realize this impact for food security. We want to make it into consultation with you. It should not be my agriculture sector package, it should not be the Open Data Charter agriculture sector package, but it should be the agriculture sector package of the global community. And that's why we are inviting policy advisors which are here, agriculture experts which are here, data technicians which are here, to all come with their recommendation. My question to you today and also tomorrow is, what is your message to the agricultural sector package? What would you like to share with governments from your experience that's valuable to them, which when they step into this open data development? And then considering the complexity of the challenge, it never can be a blueprint. So it's going to be an inspirational resource. To invite governments to take the first step, opening up key data sets, but they need to get to look at the local context, and then at the end of the whole trajectory, create impact in agricultural in the agriculture sector. And I'm going to ask, am I really? Because I've got about 15 minutes in total.
15?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Then I do it. Otherwise, I'm good. Okay. So there's more time. So what is our process? So we started in July this summer with an online consultation, basically validating the approach with the community, but also to collect ideas around relevant data sets for the agricultural sector. In August, I followed it up, having consultations with different experts to give more body to these suggestions. Today, we're at the summit with a workshop this afternoon, and we're going to look at the key data categories. It's difficult to get to global common denominator, but I want to know within this community, what do you consider as the key data sets that should be released by a government, and how can they implement it best? Then at the Open Data Conference in Madrid, we will look further and at different strategies to implement an open data infrastructure being a government. And then in December, the official launch is planned of the first version of the agricultural sector package, and there we will find out if it will really get embraced by different governments. Then on your chair there was a little sheet, and I now want to take a little bit of time for a consultation. And I'm inviting you to select 5 data categories which you consider the most important data sets that should be part of the agricultural sector pack. So just quiet for a few moments, and if you get your pen and tick the box. So for reasons of time, and do continue talking, we asked the same question during our consultation, and these were the results. So don't spy on it. Just I'm really looking for your own opinion, and I'm not going to discuss what comes out of it. But as you can see, the first 3 data sets, geospatial data, meteorological data, and market data, it's only based on a small number of respondents, but it gives an impression. And to my surprise, data sets which are really core to government, they're not considered very important, at least in this consultation. Also, while doing this, I realized, like, getting to a data classification, it never gets ideal. There's always one data set that sticks out, but it will be a different one depending on the person who you're talking to. So we have to get to a sort of understandable compromise. And it also made me realize that it's difficult to understand why different data sets are being selected. And this afternoon we're going to take the next step. So we're going to prioritize the data set, but we're going to discuss the potential impact we see and the easiness of publication, looking at it from a government perspective. So this is more easily said than done. As you all know, determining impact is very difficult. Being a young development, it's even more difficult. So what I came up with is this impact evaluation matrix. So each of the value chain actors, which I nicely grouped in 4 groups, can use the data concretely to contribute to the 3 food security challenges where this package wants to contribute to. So concretely, if we're looking at land registration data, so data is indicating the ownership of land. Maybe it's also indicating where that land is and the boundaries of it. So what kind of impact could we expect if that's becoming open data? So if a farmer if a farmer is certain on the ownership of his data, you may get a different farming perspective. If you're not sure you can farm next year, you may want to get as much harvest as possible. Whereas you know that for generations you can use the same land, you will do it in a more sustainable way. It will also allow you to build up more sustainable relations with different value chain actors. I can think of the input suppliers or with traders, getting a better advantage point there. For the financial service providers, having ownership of land, that ownership can function as collateral. So you can loan more money. With that money you can buy fertilizer, seeds, so you can increase your production. But also for a governance actor, having that data available, it's more easy to monitor the farm, to monitor the productions, and to do better planning in relation to the production, how much nutrients are needed in a certain area, or how much markets are needed, or how is the trade going to develop this year. So these are just examples, and the matrix, the examples can be disputed, but at least you can talk about it, and you can start to understand why some people find some data sets maybe more important than others, and maybe we can get to the key data sets for agriculture. So on the other axis there's the ease of publication. So the different questions you can ask. The first question is the data already in possession of the government or in the government-related agency? Is it already machine readable, digital, or is it somewhere stuck in a pile of papers and need a lot of processing to become available online? Is the recommendation to make a certain data set available, is that a global recommendation valid for many countries, or is it very specific? And then there are the sensitivities about data, and Jeremy de Beer and Tara Raymond will talk much more about it, but there are privacy issues, there are issues related to data ownership. Before publishing data, you should really be aware what can be the consequences, also the unintended consequences of making the data available as open data. So that's all part of the ease of publication. So what is our process? So today we're going to focus on prioritizing data sets in the afternoon, so you're all invited for that. In Madrid we're going to focus on the implementation of open data strategies as a government, and then there will be the launch in December. I'll be here for 2 days, even on Saturday a bit, and I really like to hear your message to different governments. What can we learn from your experience and should be part of the open data agriculture sector page. I'm done.
Thank you to Andre for sharing about the agriculture sector package. I think it's a great illustration of just how complex the agriculture sector is, but also I really liked the matrix you presented as a way of thinking about what are the different user needs for those different data set categories and how can we try and understand that more. So before we move into the next project presentation, we have time for maybe just one question from the audience. If you have something you would like to clarify or a reaction, we have a microphone in the centre, but our trusty volunteer Olivia can run the microphone to you. I see 2 hands raised. The first I saw was this gentleman at the back here with the graduate.
Standards in the early 80s, and seeing that they only benefited the businesses at the top of the pyramid, how do you ensure that your standards are going to benefit the farmer behind the oxen?
I cannot ensure that. It should ensure. It's part of the process. So it's one of the things I call sensitivities that should be really considered. Who will be benefiting from the data? And there are many issues there. I can agree, and we need to be aware of that. And it's not all sunshine. That's my answer. I can only agree.
Okay, maybe one more question? Yeah, right here at the front.
Can you just say a little bit more about what your approach to making the data interoperable is?
I'm not going up with a new approach. So basically what I'm doing is collecting the knowledge that's already there, trying to get it organized and present it in such a way to the users of this package, which in this case are governments and technicians within the government, to make it attractive, to sort of guide them into a whole world which already exists. And I'm going to redo that, but I want to build on that. Is that an answer?
Yeah, kind of.
Maybe just to add to what Andre was saying, there are a number of other initiatives working on standards at the moment, and I believe there's a presentation tomorrow in the agenda by a program of GODAN and DFID, and the ODI is also involved, going more in depth into those standards. So you're feeling invited to join tomorrow. So, having covered a little bit, just scratch the surface of what are those core data assets currently owned and managed by governments. Now we're going to move on to consider what are some other, nonetheless critical data assets that are currently being produced or held elsewhere by donors, by not-for-profits and philanthropists. So, it is my great pleasure to welcome Stan Wood to the stage, who is Senior Program Officer of Policy and Data in the Agricultural Program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He's going to give a short opening address about why this is so important for us to have open data on agriculture funding, and it'll be followed by 2 presentations from Leia Greeno, who is Director of Transparency and Accountability at Interaction, and then Stephen Flowers, Director of Open Data Services Co-op. And they will be discussing more about the Open Agriculture Funding Initiative project, and also the role that standards do play within that. So,
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introductions. Great to be here. I hope you all have your Chinese medical products that will be tested on the way up. I was pleased to see on one of the slides that we just presented that actually ag funding was right in the center of being one of the most important data sets. Following the money, it's not a guarantee that the outcomes are going to be great, but it's a good indicator that things are on a positive track. And we know that there are initiatives already. The ERT is a great framework and being increasingly utilized. We came across this from the foundation's perspective. The foundation, like many other donors, are members of ERT, and they report our information to that. But it tends to be used at a very high level to exchange information about how much you're giving and where. Our ambition is to go further than that, and how operationally can we use data about agricultural funding to help us at a more granular level identify who is working on what, where, and with whom, and for what purposes, so that we as investors in this sector can better align our investments with others in the sector. And that could be other donors, it could be others in governments, etc. But if our maintained hypothesis is if we had better information about agricultural funding, that we could better either collaborate or coordinate our activities, or we could decide not to do an activity in an area because it's already well funded and move elsewhere. We could be more efficient in our use and allocation of resources collectively if we had that information available to us. So very optimistically went to the open data meeting, I think last year, learned more about ERT and the great work it's doing, but really very problematic about if you're trying to record things about agriculture, there is no commodity code, for example, as a standard code within ERT. So the idea of this project came out of that, which is how can we dig deeper to, if you like, build out the granularity and the specificity of the coding that would allow us to have more operational insights into who it, is USAID investing in lethal necrosis for maize in western Tanzania, and with whom, and knowing that maybe would help us decide to make our investments. So part of that work, you're going to hear more about it now, is to help build out those ERT codes. The group from Interaction is working with ERT to set up, I don't know whether it's been set up already, an agricultural working group below the technical advisory group to build out those codes. There are other things to talk about, which is how do you also then, the codes, the investments are recorded according to OECD DAC standards, which also don't have sufficient granularity to allow us to get down to the type of the thematic areas we like to invest in. So there's other spin-offs we'd like to see about elaborating the OECD DAC codes. And we'd also like to do this by using obviously the structure of ERT, not create anything new, but build out according into that framework and build on the great work that's done by others. And I think in particular here FAO, the work around AgriVoc and the standardization of taxonomies and terminologies that we don't need to invent again, we just need to make sure they're embedded in there. So we are trying to get a coordinated grant to our colleagues in FAO to make sure that these pieces are all brought together to bear onto that problem. Anyway, we see tremendous benefits of opening up, making this data more interoperable, making it more accessible, and leading to much greater efficiencies in the allocation of our research and development funds. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks to Stan for setting the scene for this project. I think he explained really well what we're aiming to accomplish. So my name is Laia Grino, as Fiona said, and I manage the Initiative for Open Ag Funding for Interaction, which is the largest alliance of international NGOs and partners in the United States. And our official partners in this endeavor are Development Gateway, the Foundation Center, the CGIAR's research program on policies, institutions, and markets led by IFPRI, Publish What You Fund, and Open Data Services. And I say that they're just our official partners because our aim really is to collaborate with as many organizations as possible in ensuring that we accomplish the goals of our initiative. So, what are those goals? Like everyone in this room, the ultimate goal that we're trying to contribute to is to end hunger and reduce food insecurity. And that, of course, is going to take many and varied efforts by a wide range of actors. So what we hope to contribute is data that enables organizations to make better decisions about how to use their resources. And specifically, as Stan said, we want to make it easier for organizations to find answers, or to be able to answer the question, who's doing what, where, with whom, and to what effect. Before I say more about the initiative, I do want to acknowledge that we fully recognize that information on who's doing what where alone isn't enough to enable organizations to make more effective decisions about how to use their resources. And that's exactly why initiatives like GODAN and the Ag Sector Package that we just heard about are so important. In addition to knowing what is happening, organizations need to know more about the context in which those interventions are really taking place. So that's really critical information to make available as well. But each data set has its own challenges, and so we've made a very conscious decision that we want to specifically focus on this investment data pieces in this initiative. So, why is it still so difficult to answer what seems like a very easy question of who's doing what where? In open data circles, or at least in the aid transparency circles that we're a part of, we've gone from really pushing people to make more data available to a concern that at this point supply is outstripping demand. We often hear from data publishers that we work with, we've made all this data available, we heard there's 500,000 data sets available, why isn't anyone using this information? But I think that's not a bit of a misconception. Though there is a lot of data available, in talking to organizations, we found that across the board, they've emphasized how difficult and time-consuming it is for them to find the information that they need. And so they end up commissioning consultants to do landscape analyses for their own organization, or they rely on personal networks to find that data. It's really not within their hands' reach. So that's the problem we'd like to solve. One of the first things we did as part of this project was to take a closer look at what data is being collected and what data is being shared publicly related to agricultural investments. And we found that there is a lot of information available, as we all know, and this data has different characteristics. Some of it is historical, some of it is forward-looking, some is at the aggregate level, presenting overall or aggregate statistics on funding for the sector, while other is project, very detailed information on activities taking place. And that's where we are focusing our efforts. So there is a lot of data available, but there's several issues that are preventing users from being able to use this information. So what are some of those problems? First, there's gaps. Not everyone working in the sector is sharing information about their work, and that includes governments, donors, NGOs, foundations, but also the private sector and partner country governments as well. And those who are sharing information sometimes aren't sharing information on all of their portfolio. There's issues around quality. In many cases, the data isn't good enough for people to answer the questions they have. And so in this initiative, we are trying to define what quality means from a user's perspective. There's issues around accessibility. We're finding that some key data sets aren't presented in ways that would be useful to practitioners and other decision makers, or it's difficult to just plainly access the data. There's issues around awareness. Many people simply don't know that the data they're looking for actually exists. So as a community, we're putting a lot of effort into making data available, but not doing enough to connect with the users that would be in a position to use that information to let them know it's there for them to use. And finally, there's issues around capacity to use data, and especially given complexities of the aid system, this is something that needs to be invested in further. So our challenge as the Initiative for Open Ag Funding is to narrow the gap between the data that's provided and the data that users actually need. And we're making a concerted effort to base our work on those user needs. And so to get a better understanding of what those are, we've over several months did consultations with NGOs, foundations, and donors to ask them, well, first to confirm that they actually need this information, what data they do need, and then what they need that data for. So these are just some examples of what we heard from the organizations we talked to about why having data on investments is important. And I won't read them out loud, but as you can see, there's issues around coordination, being able to leverage other resources, just more efficiency in how resources are being used. And as Ms. Stetson said in the plenary this morning, there's just not enough, we can't endlessly add to the amount of money we're dedicating to solving these problems. We need to learn how to use resources more efficiently. As far as what we found regarding the data that users specifically need, it falls into 6 broad categories. So first, it's just a need to know what is being funded. What's the nature of the interventions taking place? What are the value chains that are focused on? What are the goals and objectives of the work? What approaches are people taking to solve particular problems? Second, there's a need to know where interventions are taking place. Often you can find what country an intervention is based in, but you really need subnational location information to make good decisions. We need to know who's involved in a project, either providing the funding, but also especially who's responsible for implementing that work at the local level. We need to know about the financial information related to a project. What's the budget of the project overall? What is it going to? How much is being spent, etc. Fifth, which populations are being served? What are the characteristics of the groups meant to benefit from this assistance? And finally, we heard that there's very much a need for information on the results of these projects. And finally, in terms of what organizations need data for, basically, I think different groups need data for different things, from making basic decisions about how to allocate resources to fundraising and advocacy if you're an NGO, for example. But I think what links all of these uses together is that overall the community is really interested in maximizing the use of their resources so they can have the greatest impact on ending hunger and food security and improving food security. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague Stephen, who's going to talk more about how we're approaching standards to solve some of the problems we've identified. Thank you.
Hey everybody, my name's Stephen Flower. I'm from Open Data Services Cooperative. So we provide services around open data and we're cooperative, as we imaginatively titled ourselves. Whilst I mess with the slides and get them going, and there, can we put them on now please, sir, at the back? I'm going to talk through sort of the end of the project really, where we're at now and what we're doing with standards. And okay, let me press OK. And to pick up on the question, how do we connect supply and demand? And we found around standards are very interesting to talk to the question later on that you raised. we found that people, when data's not standardised or not accessible, there's often workarounds. People make their own data or keep their own data somewhere else, and that makes it very difficult to address some of the questions that we're trying to answer. So our answer to how do we collect supply and demand is standards, and lots of awareness raising and capacity building to take these different sources of data and ensure that people can use data across organisations to answer some of these questions. So, of course, we could have built, devised, conceived a brand new standard, and we could have spent a lot of time thinking of another new standard, and we could have got to 15 standards or 864 standards. I'm going to ask you some numbers in a moment, but yeah, we could have done that. But our landscape analysis that we conducted, when we looked around and thought about investment on agriculture projects, led us to the International Aid Transparency Initiative. And this is a very active community of data, standardised and shared. The 472 is the number of organisations that are currently publishing data using the IIT standard. When I first started working with IIT 4 years ago, there were 4. So the growth in the number of organisations using the IIT standard to describe who, where, what they're doing is growing significantly. A question for you. Each one of these organisations publishes data, and they publish in the XML format using the IIT standard, and they publish data about the projects that they're working on, the investments that they make. So across the 472, let's just take three numbers from the audience. How many projects do you think are expressed using IIT across those 472? Anyone shout out a number? Any number? This is the audience participation bit, by the way. So anybody give me a number?
2,000.
2,000, thank you, sir. Another one?
10,000.
10,000. One more answer.
42.
42. So, thank you, all those numbers. So the winner was the 10,000. I think you win some.
I will claim it though.
Yeah, you win some data. I'll give it to you later on. There was actually 646,967 projects published this morning using the IIT standard across those 472 organisations. So it's a real interesting data standard, and not only is it the handbook that describes what you should do and how you should format your data, but it's the playbook as well about how you should share, license and use your data as well. So it's a really active community, and that's why we're centering on IIT as part of this project. So what we've been doing, we're proposing looking at IIT, looking at the questions that we have: who, where, what, how much, who's being targeted, and then we're digging deep down in the IIT standard to look at some of the fields, some of the data points within the IIT standard, and how could they help us address those questions. So this afternoon we've got the workshop to look at that in more depth and start to do some prioritisation around some of these, and also ask what is missing in IIT to help us with these questions. Okay, I've got some time left, not much. What we should also say though is those 472 organisations publishing IIT data in the format, but we can conceive multiple entry points to this. So some organisations may just publish data using the IIT format, others may convert their data, and in some cases others may get together, this gets even more complicated, get together and format their data with others. So we're really interested in not only the publishers of the data, but the intermediaries and the users as well, in looking and using the standard to answer these questions. It's not a linear path of just one organisation publishing, but organisations working together to implement the standard to answer our questions. And the last point I'll leave you with really is to Stan's point as well. Of those 672,000 activities, we think there are around about 50,000 that sort of say that they're involved in ag. So 50,000 of 672,000. So that's because the classifications are quite blunt. The OECD DAC classifications currently in use are not really helping us. So the two areas that we really focus on within IIT is how can we use the great
Thank you so much to Stephen and Lyron.
I think your project is a really great example of just how difficult it is to get to the heart of user needs, and when you do that, you start to open up the gaps that are existing in terms of the level of data required, the subnational level, and also that level of granularity. So we have time again for 1 to 2 questions from the audience. I see someone very eager here in the centre. I'll be like to step forward, please, and say your name and organisation.
Hi, Richard Galbraith, University of Vermont. What I'm struggling with here is that the outcome seems to be almost just another measurement, and it seems to be. I mean, if you put money where somebody else isn't putting money, it doesn't mean that the project that somebody else is putting money in is going to work. So it seems to be back arsewards. It seems to me we should be looking at the outcome as the driver and not where somebody's put money with the assumption that if they put it there, there will be some beneficial effect. Can you help me understand? I just don't understand the logic of that.
Perhaps, is that a one for Laia?
Maybe, could I maybe say something to that?
Yeah.
Could you repeat the question? No, I think very much, absolutely, that there's not a presumption that just because money is spent, the outcome is going to be good. But there's a couple of reasons. One is you have to start somewhere, and just getting the basic information about projects, what is actually going on, that first order information is actually, as we know, very difficult even to organize that. Our ambitions are actually to find out the results and the impact, because that's really where we want to be. But collecting outcomes without having, because also outcomes tend to happen at the end of projects. We would like to know now what's happening. In fact, we'd even like to know what's being planned. Because if we know at the planning stage, we could even do a better job of trying to sort of coordinate our resources. Definitely that's the holy grail. What is actually happening on the ground is what we really want to go. But we have to set up a sort of infrastructure to build on to make that happen. And as Laia said, get those standards and those tools used by sufficient people that crowds people in, and the quality becomes better over time. But I take your point that it's a work in process, but that's where we want to be. Exactly. Thanks.
Yeah, and if I could just add something to that, I've worked in the aid transparency field. Okay, I've worked in the aid transparency field for 6-7 years at this point. And over that time, I've consistently learned about initiatives that people have started up that are aimed at providing information on who's doing what where. And the reason for that is that there's an incredible amount of duplication of effort, a complete lack of awareness of very related initiatives or initiatives that actually undermine each other. And if you can't identify the potential synergies or the things you should take into account in your own planning, you're not going to be using your resources most effectively. But we also do recognize that having information on results is critical. That's why we are trying to address that to some extent in emphasizing what information should be made available related to projects, because we've also heard that organizations very much want to take into account what approaches have been successful or not successful as they design their own programs. So it's a small contribution, but like we said, it's one piece of what people need to know to use resources effectively.
Okay, time for one more question. I see a hand up the back there.
Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm David Galati from TechnoServe. A very particular question. I think what's been showcased today, I think, is very positive. And what I don't want this to be interpreted as a criticism, but I've looked at the way in which data is being, the whole concept of data being used for the decision-making process, following the chronological, which is very, very natural. But I think what we found in our organization, I think it's a lesson, or at least something we should be thinking about in the greater community, is actually turning that around and looking at it from a user perspective. So right now we're looking at, okay, we have all this data, which is relevant and what do we do with it? As opposed to looking at it from the opposite perspective, which is, what are the particular policy decisions that we want to make? And they will be very different. There are those that are making decisions at a strategic level. I think that's where Stan is really coming from. And there are others that are making decisions on a tactical level. And each of those would have different results regarding what data then would be needed and what process we need to go through to have that data interpreted and then used in the right way. So I would hope in the course of the discussions that we start to narrow that down and say, because one thing that I think I've seen, and most probably here have seen the same thing, you end up collecting so much information and spending so much time that when you realize what are the 3 or 4 bits of information that you're really using, I think that's gets straight to the inefficiencies and the cost savings that we'll be talking about, I think, today. It doesn't sound like a question, but it was certainly a question posed to all of you.
I just want to say that's a great question, and that's actually the approach we're trying to take in this project. So I really hope you will stick around for the workshop this afternoon, because that's what we want to know. What data do users need to accomplish a very particular thing related to their work, and use that as the basis for determining what data organizations should prioritize making public. So yes, we are trying to start from the perspective of the users. I hope you'll come.
I think my observation is as well, when I witnessed the growth of IATI from 4 to 472 organisations, quite a lot of organisations just published using the IATI format because the data was there and they could publish. Where organisations are moving to now is, what would make my data useful for X, Y or Z, and how can I use the standard to do that? And I think that's very different from where organisations may have been a few years ago. So I hope you come to the workshop this afternoon, please.
Great, yes, thanks so much for that interjection. It's definitely at the forefront of, I think, all of our minds at the moment. So now we're going to shift pace a little bit. Having discussed some issues around identifying what those useful data assets are, and to a degree what are some of the standards that help to kind of organise and give shape to that. Now we're going to move on to consider what is the governance framework that sits across how this data is owned and managed and used. And I think that we'll address one of the questions that we heard earlier this morning about how do we ensure that some of the benefits flow back to farmers themselves and people actually producing some of that data. So to frame this conversation, I'd like to invite Dr. Hans Christoph Eiden, who is President of the Federal Office for Agriculture and Food, representing the German Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture, to provide some opening remarks. And this will be followed by Professor Jeremy de Beer from the University of Ottawa Law Faculty, who is going to present some new research on different frameworks we might consider for navigating data ownership in agriculture. And lastly, to round us off, we will have Zara Rahman, a research lead at the Engine Room, who's going to be presenting on some responsible data challenges, especially with reference to some of those power imbalances between actors within the agriculture ecosystem. So, Dr. Hans Christoph, if you will. Thank you.
Hello, good morning everyone. So I'm honored now to comment already on a paper which will be presented then later on. It's this paper on ownership of open data, governance options for agricultural nutrition, presented by Professor Jeremy de Beer, who has analyzed and structured options for actions towards the further development of property rights to open data. And the aim is to open files to a considerably larger extent and to make them available for many users, while at the same time protecting legitimate interests of all parties concerned. So we are talking about ownership of open data. That sounds contradictory, and it is indeed. At least there's some tension between the two terms. But it is a fact that often enough rights to data prevent their transformation from data to open data. This is the central statement and the starting point for Jeremy de Beer's analysis. in which I must say he interprets the term open data broadly. Open data in his analysis include all files that are accessible to an unlimited circle of users. With that he goes beyond the narrower traditional definition of open data, which are data which are accessible without obstacles in the technical sense, namely machine readable data. I find this approach useful as it includes many regulatory systems. Jeremy Lebert divides the manifold regulatory systems to be found around the globe, and he divides them in 3 dimensions: technical, legal, and social framework conditions. So I will now not go more in detail, but rather highlight some points which strike me, and that maybe then be an input for the further discussion and make you aware of what we're talking about. So very interesting are the case studies. They are most illustrative as a means to come to a more concrete discussion on how to improve the effective use and the sharing of open data under different societal, technical, and political conclusions. And as an example, what it means to take into account the different actors and their interests. While it is evident there is no solution of a one-size-fits-all type, and while we have to recognize that there are different habits, traditions, different stages of legal concretization, one common principle, I think, can be identified, and the respect of this principle may be the key for success. It is about fair access and fair benefit sharing. There is ownership of data, ownership along the different stages of collecting, processing, and interpretation of data, according to the input made, from traditional knowledge to highly sophisticated software interpretation tools, or from supplier to aggregator, developer, enricher, and to enablers, as Deloitte distinguishes the archetypal open data actors. Every actor, be it a smallholder farmer, an IT software development company, or a big international community, will only be willing to share his knowledge if he or she is convinced that sharing his data will grant him a benefit and access, legally spoken as well as technically. That means that I cannot simply declare data as open. If I want to rely on a very broad range of data, and if I want to rely on a set of data which are continuously nourished by new information and further developed interpretation tools, then we have to work on systems that are based on access and benefit sharing and which take into account the practical needs of actors. That means that we need government structures which guarantee this so much needed balance of interests and platforms for exchange, and I think that's the environment which some people were speaking about this morning in the opening plenary. The issue we are talking about are global, but does that mean that the solution is necessarily global? Jeremy Lebert states that no single government's mechanism is capable of resolving ownership issues. He presents 4 possible strategies, but nevertheless, he considers continued interinstitutional cooperation the first and most obvious strategy towards a government's solution. And in this respect, he refers to us, assembled here at the summit, and he invites us, as GODAN partners, to consider a convening and advocating role for GODAN, pushing forward not only consensus building and interinstitutional cooperation, but inspiring also other appropriate governance solution, and perhaps the agricultural package we were just talking about, maybe some idea for that. And this might move on, I need 2 minutes, sorry. This might then also lead us in the end, at the long run, to something like an international agreement, like similar to the Convention of Biological Diversity or the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. So I think that's, and now you are going to listen to him more in detail. Perhaps you can try also to establish ideas what might be the place for GODAN in the future, what might be its role in this process, and what our contribution could be. And I think there's also need to come to concrete ideas, to concrete terms, what we should concentrate on the global level and what should be left to other partners. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andre. Thank you to GODAN and all of its partners for the opportunity to work on this topic and then to present the results of my research here to you today. It was an open and collaborative process of developing a think piece on the topic of ownership of open data. And during the process, I worked closely with Martin Parr and Tim Davies and Ben Schaap and over a dozen different collaborators who shed light on the problems that I'm about to discuss, some of the challenges. And that work was funded not only by GODAN, but by partners such as Canada's International Development Research Centre and collaboration with a research network that I'm a part of, the African Innovation Research Network, Open Air. I don't have any slides today. What I have instead is an infographic that summarizes in 2 pages a 40-page report. If you don't have a copy at the back, I have a few extras here. Perhaps, Olivia, you could help and we could pass those around at the back. Thank you very much. Also, thank you for your patience standing for this entire time. There's one extra seat now at the end of the table if anybody would like to borrow it temporarily. Okay, so I'm going to dig a little bit more deeply into a particular challenge. This morning, the panelists during the open plenary were challenged to identify the biggest obstacle to the adoption of open data. I would submit to you that challenges around ownership and governance are currently one of the biggest obstacles to the widespread adoption of open data. Let me give you a practical example. Suppose that you're a farmer in a rural environment outside of Kampala, Uganda. And in your farming operations, you rely on a mixture of traditional knowledge, potentially from an indigenous and local community, about your agricultural practices, as well as community knowledge provided to you potentially by an NGO or by a government agency. Combined with that, you're obtaining new sources of data from mobile apps that give you real-time data about commodity prices or weather patterns. That data is layered on top of data held by potentially an international organization or an intergovernmental organization or the national government. There are also stakeholders, including private sector companies that may operate the platforms that provide access to this data. And this data may be used, provided by the farmer and used by the farmer as well as her neighbors. So the question arises, who owns that open data? What rights do the various stakeholders have in that data? And what responsibilities do all of those stakeholders have to protect or share or otherwise treat that data? In the research that I did, it became clear to me that the ownership of open data, or the lack thereof, is one of the most important factors shaping power dynamics in the global open data community. And when you analyze the legal ownership structures around open data, it becomes clear that ownership rights accrue mostly to the intermediaries who collect and hold the data. very few rights are held by the farmers who provide the data, or very few rights or freedoms accrue to the users of open data, except those provided in open licenses. And so the first thing that the paper does is it tries to get a better sense of what the sources of open data are. Farmers themselves, aerial drones, smart tractors, government data repositories, traditional indigenous communities, and so on. And so after identifying some of the sources of open data, begin to map some of the power dynamics and the relationships around the topic. And I identified 3 different components to ownership and governance of open data. There's a technical component, there's a social component, and there's a legal component. So the technical component, for example, is something that I think we're all familiar with, related to interoperability, the machine readability, and the way in which data can be compatible with particular platforms or is able to be integrated with other data sets. But there's also a social dimension to ownership and governance. In many communities, we observe that cultural norms, particularly cultural norms around trust, are more important than technical or legal norms when it comes to governing who can do what with data. The next part of the puzzle that I identify in the paper is the legal dimension. And the essential point that I would encourage everyone to think about is that we need to give more consideration as a community to the underlying rights and responsibilities around open data. From a legal perspective, it's too easy for us to simply cite open licenses, whether it's a Creative Commons license or another form of open licensing, as taking care of all of the legal issues. Oh, it's open because there's an open license and that governs the terms and conditions on which people have access to data. But if you look at what's happening at a deeper level, in terms of national legislative systems, international trade agreements, international treaties, we see a much broader array of legal instruments, economic policies, and other governance frameworks that impact ownership of open data. So we need to start paying greater attention to technological measures, and in particular legal protections for technological protection measures. Laws that make it illegal to circumvent technological measures that are applied to data sets. In some jurisdictions, most notably the EU, but also places like Mexico, we have sui generis database rights that work alongside copyright law to control who can do what with open data. If you look at the trends in international trade law, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and the EU, or the Transatlantic Trade Partnership that's being negotiated. In these agreements are chapters dealing with intellectual property rights, and one of the most notable features of these chapters are provisions that deal with trade secrets and confidential information. And so what we see is a shift in the policy environment to actually favor more secrecy and more confidentiality and afford strong protection for that. But we don't see a similar policy mechanism to encourage or facilitate openness around data. And that's something that we as a community need to interrogate more closely. Dr. Eiden discussed some of the governance solutions that I identify. I should be clear that I'm not suggesting that any of these are the right path forward, but these are things that we as a community might want to think about. The first and most obvious is right, interinstitutional cooperation. GODAN and its partners can continue the dialogue around this topic of ownership. But another idea is a social certification scheme around open data, like the fair trade movement or the organic certification movement, where there can be bodies put in place that are entrusted to certify the provenance and compliance with core values around open data. And users can be assured that the data complies with those standards. Another option is model frameworks at the national level. International agreement can be very hard to reach, but we can see examples, and I describe these in the paper, of situations where initiatives taken by one country, Kenya, like we heard this morning, the United States, the United Kingdom, can have a ripple impact. And over a period of years, potentially decades, those policies can be emulated by other countries around the world. I talk a little bit about how that can happen in the paper. The most ambitious is, of course, an international treaty or an international agreement around open data. I raise that possibility in the paper, but not in a way that should take our eyes off the short-term gains that can be had through forums like GODAN and this particular summit. So with that, I encourage you to get a copy of the infographic, read the paper, and discuss it with me and with each other. So thank you very much.
Next we have Sarah.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. Can you get the slides up? Yeah, just to introduce myself. My name is Zara Rahman. I work at an organisation called the Engine Room. We're a non-profit organisation that work to support the use of technology and data in social change for other organisations. So I'm actually not going to talk so much about data, but more about people. So one of our programs is called the Responsible Data Program. Is there things I should do? How should we show these? Yeah.
If anyone has great tech skills and would like to volunteer too, I'm looking at you.
All right, I can talk anyway. So yeah, one of our programs is called the Responsible Data Program. We look at the ethical, legal, privacy and security challenges of using more and more data in all sorts of sectors, from humanitarian to here in the agriculture sector to in journalism, for example. And we really think it's important to think about, again, to really think about the people's concerns, and not just what can be possible, but what should be possible. Like, even if some things are technically possible, they're not perhaps ethically sound. So yeah, I've done this. So we kind of coordinate this community called the Responsible Data Community, and yeah, there's more on that site of the other work that we and other partners have done. So just to give you a little run through of some of the findings that we found, we wanted to look at the responsible data challenges that come from all this new data that is in the agriculture sector, from open data, but also things that come from, for example, precision agriculture or satellite farming or smart tractors, as was already mentioned. And we wanted to think about what are the concerns of people, of smallholder farmers, of people who are basically creating this data and generating this data, but perhaps not in a position where they can use this data. So we started by mapping what we kind of saw as a broad data ecosystem. So this is a bit broader than just open data, just to say. And that's in the paper as well, so you can look at that. It's a little bit small, perhaps. And yeah, so in the data overview, we discuss open data, but also accessibility. So I think, as some people have mentioned already, just because open data is there, even if it's machine readable and accessible and openly licensed, doesn't mean that people will use it, especially if you don't have access to a computer, or you just never looked at a spreadsheet before, or you don't really care what's in a spreadsheet because you've got other things to care about. And then data quality, which was also a thing that was brought up quite a lot. By people that we spoke to, just saying that the data is not always right. And when it's data about you, and you don't really have a mechanism to say that it's not right, but where do you go if you see something that you know just isn't correct? There's sometimes very little recourse for saying or for letting your perspective be known. And that was a really big concern that we heard from lots of people. So just to run through quickly what we saw as the responsible data challenges. So as I said, this is kind of the umbrella of ethical, legal, privacy, security, all of those. Data breaches. This is a responsible data challenge that we're seeing in all sorts of areas. I mean, like every week there seems to be like government got hacked or company got hacked and all that kind of stuff. Data breaches, but also in sensitive data. So for example, if you're working with mobile phones and sending SMS alerts, it's actually impossible to know who's read the SMS. If it's a shared mobile phone between a husband and a wife, in certain communities, it's normally the husband who gets access to the phone, even if the data being sent is about the wife. And that can cause certain tensions. It's also very difficult to know what data has been breached and who has access to it and what they do. So that's a big one. Sensitive data, who decides what is sensitive? And this was a really interesting one to talk about with people. So some things that I might consider are totally not sensitive. So like weather's a bad example. Like what I'm growing in a certain area might be actually kind of sensitive if you're in competition with someone else who's next door to you and you don't want them to know, say, as an example. And I think lots of these decisions around what is sensitive, what should be made open and what's not, are coming from the top down. They're not coming, there's not really very many opportunities for people who are contributing or who that data is about to actually make those concerns known. And some concerns that we heard around sensitive data sets was basically anything to do with indigenous people. Seeds, recipes, local knowledges. And in one way that's seen to be, it's useful to kind of categorize into half, but it can put lots of people in danger. So data ownership, I won't go into this because that's, Jeremy's piece discusses in much more detail. Vulnerable communities, as I said, indigenous populations, migrant farmers. And then some tensions, which were very similar to the challenges, actually. Farm profiling. So this is one, you know when you're on like Google and they build a user profile of you based on what you search. There are companies who are building profiles of farms based on what they buy, what they can tell from satellite imagery, and the farmers don't have any way of knowing what these profiles are, just like we don't have any way of knowing what Google's got as our profile. And this can actually affect like what they get sold, what prices they're offered, all sorts of things. That's a really big concern. Benefit sharing, and Fatma is here and she's going to talk a little bit more about that later, I think. But it seems that lots of the data that's being created and generated, people are making, or companies, mainly based in the US, are making profits from it. But the people who the data is about aren't making any profit from it. And lots of people were very pragmatic about this and just simply said, look, if profit's going to be made off my data, I want to be part of it. And they don't seem to have much choice about it, but it seems like it would be good to have everyone at the table to be able to discuss where this is going. Information asymmetry, as I mentioned, accessibility is not the same as availability. Quality affects this. Who has actual access? Who has time to delve into all these open data sets? Like, if we're talking about farmers and especially smallholder farmers that live year to year or season to season, they're probably not going to spend their evenings like diving into open data sets. So yeah, I think that's a big top-down information asymmetry issue. And then lots of known unknowns. So they don't really know what's happening to their data. They don't know how they can be involved. They don't know how they're being represented in the data. If they don't want to be in certain data sets, they don't really have any way of knowing, of kind of saying, hey, take us off this. And then very quickly, best practices, so education and awareness, people who work on this, so open data and agriculture stuff, being very aware that the perspectives of indigenous people might be very different to what we're discussing here in this room. Policies, so a couple of people that we spoke to, a couple of organizations have explicit policies around how they deal with sensitive data and what they can and can't do with it, even if it is technically possible. They kind of set out explicitly those boundaries. Strengthening and enabling rights of vulnerable communities like farmers' rights, like indigenous people rights. And then really prioritizing context and taking the time to really learn what that context is and how it affects what you can or should be doing with the data. So yeah, I think these are some more links that you can look at. And yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy and Zara. And I really do recommend reading their publications. If you get a chance to get your hands on a copy. They're a really interesting read. Now, unfortunately, Zara has to duck out. It was very generous of you to be here this morning, so thank you very much. but we have time for, let's say, one question for now for Jeremy on his research around data ownership before we transition into the panel for the remaining 30 minutes. So is there a question in the room on anything to do with data ownership, about the governance frameworks mentioned? Right.
Thank you. It's Vladimir Stojkovic from the Satellite Applications Catapult in the UK. And this is a general question. You all talk about ethical and legal issues, and I believe that legal issues are dealt with by lawyers and representatives from the legal profession, of course. Who is dealing with ethical issues, please? Is it philosophers who specialize in ethics, or how is that dealt with, please? Thank you.
Jeremy, is that something you're able to comment on, or should we pose that question as follow-up to Zara on who responds to the ethical dimensions? Who should answer this question?
I think that's a crucially important point. I think that we need much more multidisciplinary engagement with all of these problems. And I don't think the legal issues ought to be the domain of lawyers. And I say this, we were talking earlier, I'm sorry, we apologize for being lawyers. But that's part of the problem, actually, is that the open data community cannot simply say, well, there's a complex ownership issue, and we know that the licensing issues are difficult to deal with, so let's just get the lawyers to apply, their wisdom to our problem. We need a much more open discussion. And I think your point about ethics goes precisely to that as well. These are issues that we all need to think about. Not to mention the social, the technical, the economic, political issues. It's a very complex problem around responsibility, rights, and ownership that we all need to do a better job of engaging with.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think on the ethical piece, I think we all should be thinking a little bit about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think too often when it comes to things like data and the technical issues, we execute without asking why, or without asking who this could harm, or why we're doing it, and what we could be doing to make it more explicitly better. So yeah, I think not just the lawyers, but echoing the multidisciplinary approach on that front.
Thanks so much. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to the next phase of this session, which is a panel discussion. So I'd like to thank all of the presenters this morning once more for detailing their projects. So if you could give them one more round of applause. Okay, so for this component, I'd like to welcome to join me on the panel some new speakers we have here in the room. The first is Fatma Ben Rajib, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Pan-African Farmers Organization. Thank you, Fatma. Also joining Fatma, we have Dr. Geraldo Amata from Brazil. Dr. Geraldo is the coordinator of Embrapa, which is the Brazilian Agriculture Research Corporation, and he's working on a scientific cooperation program in the US, I believe. And finally, to join us, we have Idris Tinto, who is a software engineer as well as an open advocate, former civic tech enthusiast, but now works for the Burkina Faso government in their Open Data Initiative. And we also have Jeremy, who is staying on this panel session. I'm feeling a bit lonely up this end of the table. If I could ask all the panelists to maybe shift up a little bit. Tinto? Could we maybe shift up? I'm trying to facilitate more of a conversation for this part of the session. I think we've all heard enough presentations and discussions, so I'm going to try and keep my interjections to a minimum. But to maybe kick us off for this remainder of the discussion, I'd really like to start by posing a question to Fatma, based on some of the audience questions we received earlier. And that is, we've heard a lot today so far about sort of the technical aspects of open data, meaning the data sets, the standards, and also the legal frameworks governing it. But how do we make sure that we're keeping people at the heart of our open data strategies? In particular, how do we keep the interests of the smallholder farmers in mind and ensuring that some of the benefits of open data are flowing back to them?
Thank you, Fiona. And thank you for GODAN to let me speak in this panel. Well, I think that we heard a lot from this morning about open data, and I think that unfortunately farmers are not very present here, and perhaps they are one of the main stakeholders and of this data, and I think that effectively one of the main objectives perhaps for us as farmers organization to have this data opened is to eradicate bureaucracy and corruption. So what are the main data? Unfortunately, I'm very annoyed with this quiz, Andre, because you told us that we have to put maximum 7 of data that should be open, but I'd like to put them all. It's very important for us to have, as well as the technical informations, the political informations, financial, etc. So it's a kind of awareness for us, and it's important also to have access to this data, but with our, it's a simplified data that we should have. As it was taught earlier, it's not really the technical, perhaps the technical data are not very known, or farmers can't understand all this data. So when they have access to such data in their own language, for example, simplified data, etc., they will feel less marginalized. It's really a chain, a link in a whole chain to have farmers aware about this data. So it's really critical. There are critical information, so such as the weather, the soil, the crops, markets, etc. But also we need to have the information about the budgets, the real statistics also, not to be not to have a good conscience to open some statistics, but the real statistics. And here we need also the awareness not only of farmers' organizations that should be strengthened. Their capacities should be strengthened to have the possibilities to access to this data and to analyze this data as well. But also to have the awareness of the civil society as a whole, to know if these statistics, these data are really reliable or not.
Thank you. If, Tinto, you might be able to share a little bit from your experience. How did you go about understanding the user needs in that project, and how did you basically get the data that you needed to help solve that problem? So pass the...
Thank you, Fiona. I'm Tinto from the Open Data Initiative of Burkina Faso, and I'm cold. I don't know if most of the people in this room are cold like me, but it's very difficult. For our project in the mapping water point in Burkina Faso, last year we got the grants from the World Bank to work in agriculture, water, and climate change sector. And in order to be sure that what we are going to do will be useful for the stakeholder, what we are doing first is to meet the government ministry, the Ministry of Agriculture, and discuss with them about the project, about what we want to do. And after that, we organize a workshop with the government, the Ministry of Agriculture, with the NGOs and private actors to brainstorm the futures of the application we want to do. And from that futures, we are going to identify the main data set that we must collect, we must find, and we must open. And during the workshop, we discovered that there is a lot of data sets that are not owned by the government. Yeah. Some data set is from the NGO and from the private sector. And we must convince them to open that data set in order to allow us to build our apps. And we started an initiative, for example, to build an ecosystem around the project. And we start meeting every Saturday, for example, for 2 months. First, to identify the data sets. Each data set describe the data set we want, and looking for where we can find this data set. For example, if an NGO like IRC say that we can find this kind of data set and we can share it with the project. But the problem is that if we are talking about water point, for example, some can have data set for one district of all the country. And the data set is not complete. And another actor have the data from another district, and it is not the same kind of information that are in the data set. So we are going to work together, government agencies and NGO, to organize, to have the data organized. And this work is very important because when we are working in the project, we are planning for the future. Because we are knowing that if we want to use the data from the community, it is important to, I'm going to talk about standardization. We are obliged to use standard in order to be able to share the data. So, I don't know if I explained well what we are doing, what's the process to identify useful data for the project. If there is question, I can maybe explain more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really wonderful example to see of the opportunities for open collaboration in this space as well, recognizing that valuable data sets are held by multiple actors within the ecosystem. So I'd like to turn now to Dr. Geraldo, to my left, from Brazil, who has a very, I think, mature open data initiative. And just picking up on some of Tinto's points, how are you going about sort of promoting open collaboration in the space, and what are the opportunities and challenges around standards, if you could? Just from Brazil.
Okay. Good morning to you all. Umbrella is the research arm of the Brazilian Ministry of Agriculture. It will be a kind of sister agents to Agricultural Research Service here in the US. We were discussing a little bit previous to the session, and the fact is a lot of information is already available, is already open in Brazil. The point is, I really enjoyed what you mentioned in your presentation a little bit earlier, is that many guys, they simply don't know where this information is, what kind of information is already available. So Actually, a lot of things already can be done. Perhaps when we are talking about structural database for Brazilian agriculture, one of the main sources, it will be the sources from the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. They just launched it a couple of weeks ago, a huge effort to make a lot of database open. So not only Embrapa, not only the Ministry of Agriculture and its agencies, but now also this huge Institute for Geography and Statistics in Brazil. And we have, regarding all those informations, spatial data and this kind of stuff, also our INPE, that will be pretty much like NASA here in the US, all this kind of information is already available. So this would be the first point. There are a lot of information open, available to anyone who wish to access. And when we go to about all this, say, the knowledge sharing behind this transformation in Brazilian agriculture, this was amazing. The past 4 decades, Brazil left a kind of traditional agriculture and turned into a very powerful science-based agriculture. And it's amazing to see that most of this information is being searching for guys here in the US, in China, but we need to increase the awareness of this information to other tropical countries as well. Regarding data standards, well, one of the points, I do agree we need to understand what they want, but of course when we consider the agricultural value chains, we're not only talking about farmers. So the first thing I would say is to identify key segments in the value chain, because in these key segments, each one of the main stakeholders, they are going to have their, their most important questions. And then we need to make sure that each segment will have a very good communication, and in both ways communication with each segment. So this is going to be key. Just to give you a very broad example, perhaps one thing that we have, it will be in the first part of the value chain, it will be the segment on what to produce. So think tanks, governments, now they have a very huge responsibility here because they own the data and they do the analysis about supply, demand, and all these kind of things. And eventually they will end with relative prices for different regions. And why is this important? For you to have an idea, in Brazil, if you consider the past 2 decades, our farmers, they received a kind of 1.6% of the gross farmers' receipts as incentives. So Brazilian farmers, they are pretty much exposed to market signals. So knowing these relative prices, this relationship, is really very important to start to decide which kind of technology they will be able to use. Then you have a kind of second block of decisions that will be very important, that you target on how to produce, and then on the production process itself, and finally when and how much to sell. More specifically, targeting standardization, there is a lack of clarity on what we want. Not necessarily the guys that who are making, all the propositions, the design of the questions are the guys that will be the final users. So sometimes the perception might be a little bit different. And if you want to think globally, we need to find a way, any way, how to translate into common data. The one thing that pops up in mind, one very common data set that we have globally is the national accounts. This is a thing that every country works more or less in this way, each one might have its own characteristics, but in the end they are going to supply information that will fit this national account. So perhaps when we are talking about globally, we will need to find national accounts standardization, otherwise it will be very tough. And one last comment very quickly. Generating data, of course, has a huge financial costs money, but is also very time consuming. And changing the format of data sometimes is really time consuming. So many of the information you're sure is already available, but to make this information usable is very time consuming. And given the pressures that we have in our daily basis, sometimes it's not easy to spare some time to start translating this information in a usable format. So in any moment, we need to talk a little bit about it, how to get all that information that was already generated, but we really want to open that information, but we do not have time to translate, to put that information in a usable format.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those comments, and I just observing, I think as a community, we're really moving past just thinking about supply towards what actually makes this data usable, and I think that's really important. So thank you. Now, I did promise that I would stop talking and open the floor to questions. So are there any burning questions that members of the audience have for any of our panelists on topics they've discussed in the projects today, or any of these issues related to what data should be shared and how this year?
Derek Scaffell from Syngenta. Really, it's kind of a bit for Jeremy, really. But just building on Fiona's point, if we want to keep the end user, our beneficiary, at the heart of this, I think just in traditional kind of IT development and delivery terms, we would be doing functional analysis and non-functional analysis, and we would scope our data and what we want to do. Are we actually missing a usable framework for ownership and entitlement that needs to be done at that point? And then we can start to take into account a lot of people's concerns around this, so that we are delivering something that fits, and we don't find out afterwards. And are there any? I mean, is anyone doing anything around that?
Thank you for that question. Syngenta was a very important contributor to the study, so thank you for that. I think the problem is that if you're a sophisticated multinational corporation or intergovernmental organization, you've got the kind of advice and the resources that you need to make decisions on how to leverage the legal framework and the political framework to get what you need out of open data and to make it work or to make it effective. But what we see is a gap between the understanding, the expectation, particularly of smallholder farmers, and the governance framework. So just to give you one very brief example, when you speak to farmers about the relationship between things they own, land or equipment, and what rights that gives them in data generated from that equipment or about that land, from, say, a digitally connected smart tractor or drone data on the land. Farmers expect that they have some rights or some control over data that's generated from those tractors or gathered by those drones. But from a legal point of view, they simply do not. They simply don't. So there's a disconnect between expectations and what I think many of us would sort of consider to be fair and equitable data benefit sharing practices and the reality in the governance frameworks. And I think we as a community need to do a better job of first acknowledging that that exists and then broadening the range of voices that are heard to come up with a solution.
Just wondering if Fatma might have any more to add to that point?
I don't want to be, it's my own opinion here, it's not the opinion of farmers as a whole, but here, let's say that with or without farmers, the farmers' data are going to be used by the private sector, by governments, by, I don't know. So there are a lot of stakeholders, as you said, so our data are going to be used. So let's say that why don't be a link in this whole chain and we provide our data and informed that by providing this data we are going to be a stakeholder in the benefit of using this data. So it's a very huge problem, I think, that the private sector has the possibility to access to this data with or without farmers' organization. So let's be in partnership in using this data, in providing and using the whole data from both sides or from all the sides of all the stakeholders.
Any more questions? Okay, we've got 3. I might take them all at once. So if we could take these 2. No, we'll take the questions and clump them, and then we'll distribute.
Okay, I'm Ian Boyd. I'm the Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK on Food and Environment. I've always been a little sceptical about open data, and nothing I've heard today leaves me less sceptical, actually. And I think the concerns are around, obviously, ownership of data, but rights of access. And I just wondered if the members of the panel could comment on the fact that the whole open data architecture actually has the potential to allow people who have, let's say, tangential ownership of data or are related to data in some way, to have the right to know how that data is being used. And I think one of the problems that we may have with open data at the moment is that we make it open, anybody can access it and they can use it in any way they want, and we don't collect information about that to feed it back to the people who actually generate the data in the first place. And we have that capability, and it might well solve some of our rights issues.
Great, perfect. Next, second question.
Fraser Brown, I'm a consultant in innovative finance. So, you know, they say the gap in smallholder finance is $400 billion. They also say there's an inflection point between the digital solutions removing some of the barriers to this lending and then the access to finance as well. So I guess my question's around more brass tacks, you know, tangible issues to do with financing smallholders. Let's say that a local finance institution in Uganda has worked out how to distribute loans at scale to smallholders. You know, smallholders, they're very, very suspicious and they're very, very cautious. I mean, in this open data idea, what can you say to that bank in terms of we would like X, Y, and Z to be open for these reasons? And we put a big sort of pressure on them, don't we, to get permission from the farmers as well. That adds a lot to their cost in terms of securing the loans and the loan agreements and everything else. All that stuff, that real tangible, granular stuff is a bit fuzzy for me.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, and if I can ask to make it very short, then we can get through them all.
Okay, so we're talking about access to data, but right now the only farmers that have, or any part of the data equation are the large high-tech farmers. So how do we first ensure that the small farmers are part of the data collection process?
Thank you. So just to summarize these questions, the first one is around rights of access and whether there are or should be some feedback mechanisms. Wondering if, are there any volunteers who want to take that question on feedback mechanisms?
From the smallholders and large corporations?
I think that perhaps, the data itself has no value. You need to put some analysis on that, and then you can get some value. And I'm not sure, irrespective of the size of the farmers, if they are going to have all the needed skills to put a value on that information. Actually, for example, many years ago, a farmer asked me which trace mineralized salt he needed to buy. I gave him 3 options, and he said, "Oh, very nice. Which one?" The 3, they were basically the same, see what is the best cost and buy it. No, he wants the name, the brand, give me, that's it. So when we are talking about this feedback loop in this conversation, actually farmers, they want information. And so they want someone to translate, to decodify those kind of data into information that can be useful to them. So strengthening cooperatives, strengthening extension services that in turn they are fueled by the research system, I think this is going to be the key.
And maybe to Jeremy, in your research, just wondering, did you find any examples of how a feedback mechanism might work whereby farmers, let's say, would have some information about how the data that they're producing is being used?
Yeah, it has to come through intermediaries. Intermediary organizations, NGOs and civil society have to mediate that relationship between smallholder farmers and other organizations.
Right. And lastly, to summarize, I think the second question, if I'm correct, is around the costs and incentives of sort of promoting publication of open data, with the example of, was it small loan granting organizations? Correct me if I'm wrong. So your question went to what are maybe like the incentives and costs around releasing open data? Or to paraphrase your question?
Yeah, well, the local bank gets very good at lending to smallholders, then it has a huge amount of data.
Right.
What are we asking it to open on a what basis?
Okay, perfect, great. Fantastic. Thank you. Sorry for capturing that incorrectly. Does anyone from the panel have some examples of open data around microfinance? And how that delivers benefits or not to agriculture? Maybe that's something that we can pick up in the workshop this afternoon, where there'll be a room full of open data agriculture experts talking about these different data categories. Now, I'm just aware of the time, and trying to be a good chair, I'd like us all to wrap up relatively on time. So please join me in thanking our final set of panelists here for sharing their insights and experiences. And just a reminder that there'll be a workshop this afternoon where we'll be continuing some of this conversation around what are the most valuable data sets, how do we prioritize them, how do we understand those user needs, and perhaps improve some of the standards that already exist, especially around open agriculture finance. We'll be in this room at 1:30. Thank you again for your participation.
So if you can clear the room fairly quickly, then the staff need to switch to the round table. So lunch is already out.
All right.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming back to the same room. So for those who weren't here in the morning, my name is Laia Brino. I work with Interaction, which is an alliance of international NGOs and partners in the United States. And Interaction is leading an initiative called Initiative for Open Ag Funding with our partners Development Gateway, Foundation Center, CGIAR, Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets, led by IFPRI, Publish What You Fund, and Open Data Services. And our goal in this project ultimately is to contribute to efforts to end hunger and reduce food insecurity. But our particular contribution to that lofty goal is to ensure that organizations have the data they need to make better decisions about how to use their resources. And let me just say that that's data that aims to answer the question, who's doing what, where, with whom, and to what effect. So granular kind of project level activities information. So these are our key activities for this project. We started off, we're on step number 3 now, that's why that lit up. So we've done an assessment of the data that's currently available. We've talked to donors, foundations, NGOs, and others to identify what data they need and what they need it for. And based on that input, we've developed our initial recommendations on what current data publishers need to do to improve the quality of their data, and also what the International Aid Transparency Initiative, which is our focal point in this project in terms of data standards, might need to do to change its standard to make it more relevant for this sector in particular. In future phases of the project, we'll be providing publishers with tools and technical assistance, and then of course there will be a big advocacy lift to make sure that people actually act on our recommendations. So as I went over this morning, and we'll talk more about the table, so I won't talk too much about this, the priority data needs we identified fall into 6 major clusters: understanding the what, the where, so what activities are taking place, what's their nature, where do they take place, who are the organizations involved, how much funding is being provided and how is it spent, who's being targeted by these activities, and then what are they accomplishing, so what are the results. And what we'd like from you today is, one, are we focusing on the right things? Have we identified the correct data elements to answer your questions and to help you make your decisions? Do we have a comprehensive enough understanding of what people need data for? We really want to understand how people will use this data in their daily work. And then finally, if you're a data publisher, is what we're proposing actually feasible? So with that, give it over to Andre.
Good. So, my name is Andre, for the people who haven't been there. I'm working on the agricultural sector package together with Fiona Smith and Olivia and Anna. And the agricultural sector package is a project at its beginning yet. It's going to be a resource to inform governments on what data to open and what policy strategies to follow to fight for food security in the agricultural sector, focusing on the 3 food security challenges. So what we want to achieve today is really to find out now what data should we recommend to publish. As I explained this morning, it's very difficult because agriculture is incredibly diverse. There are many needs, many actors, many data sets. There's an overview of the data sets, so data categories. Actually, we're going to look at it. And the question is, can we find a common denominator, or can we find a common understanding of what's important, what kind of data should be really released to advanced agriculture? And that question will be different for different places around the world. That's definitely what we are realizing. And we want to use a user-centered approach in that. So really put the actor central and next to the data sets, and get to the concrete use case of what that actor can use the data for, and identify the data sets that can be used by most actors, realizing as much as possible impact. So we're going to use impact evaluation matrix, or the idea behind it. So this is an example for land registration data, different actors or farmers. It gives them certainty on their land, resolves conflict, it stimulates them into long-term farming. It's an impact, but it also gives them the opportunity to establish long-term relationships within the value chain, or can function as collateral for financial service providers. So different actors have different, can realize different objectives with the data and different data needs behind it. And then on the other axis, which is important, is ease of publication. So where is the data within government? Can it be made easily available? Is it already available, or is it mainly in a written format? Is the recommendation valid in many countries? Is it in a machine readable format? Are there a lot of sensitivities? like Jeremy and Sarah discussed this morning around the data. Those are all things that we need to consider. So, but the end result will be the prioritization of data sets and data categories, pointing towards those data sets which should be the key data sets for the agricultural sector package.
Exactly. So you've got two projects here which are fairly advanced in thinking about what data is needed, how we meet user needs with that, and they want to really test their frameworks with you, to go deeper into those frameworks, to understand them in more depth. I was going to say something about the open data group having matured, but then I realised I had a picture of cheese up here, so that might not be appropriate. But I was thinking about the way in which open data so often gets talked about. We talk about data in the abstract, in a way that you wouldn't do with any other sort of product or commodity. If you said, I'd like to supply people with data, and you provide an undifferentiated warehouse full of the stuff without asking people what they want, you'll probably still have an undifferentiated warehouse of the stuff that no one's using, no one's taking on. Now the challenge with data is it's not like a physical product where you're left with the stock on the shelves. It's left online. There's unlimited space to store it, so we can end up just keeping on producing more and more data, publishing more and more data, but without meeting real user needs. So in this conversation, I want us to dig down and differentiate what's the specific kind of data we're talking about. In fact, the word data should not be spoken in this session without saying climate data, agronomic data, the data on where an activity is taking place, getting really specific into it, because we can recognise that we need to also think not only about what are the different kinds of data we've got, but how do we package them? How do we structure them? What features does that data need to have in order to be accessible to someone? If you just go and you can only get a big wheel of cheese, there's many things it's trickier to do. You want it packaged, prepared for you, structured in a different way. That doesn't mean, though, that it's not open. People often say, open data is about open by default. Don't think about how it's being used, just get the data out there. Thinking about the user need doesn't mean people can't then take that data and use it in many different ways to make many different things. You don't have to restrict what they do with it. So, in this session, the goal is to get specific as much as we can, answering the question, how do we make sure that open data meets demand? We're going to do that by thinking about categories of data at a broad level, starting to get specific, then going down to specific data sets. On this side of the room, we're starting from a specific data set. Data on agricultural funding. On this side of the room, we'll be looking broader. And then down to what are the features that data needs to have. Does it need to use particular standards? Does it need to be supplied in a really timely way in order to have an impact? So we're going to take you through a process that will go into that in more depth, and that process is going to have 4 parts to it. But before we do that, we want to mix up around the booth, make sure you're having conversations where you can have the most insight, and we want to get to know who's in the room. So I'd like to ask everyone to gather your stuff and just stand up and make your way towards the edge of the room so that we can find out who we've got here and then break into some different teams. So if you're all around the edge of the room, if I can ask you then, from standing on the edge there, we're going to look first at which sectors have we got represented here. So, if you're mainly working in the private sector, can I ask you just to kind of wave or step forward or indicate that we've got private sector participants in the room, a number there. You may find you wear many hats. Have we got people from governments in the room? Who's here with a government role? Okay. What about civil society or academia? Civil society and academics. What about people who feel none of those sectors represent them? You want to shout out where they are? What sector would you say you're in?
Standardization, semantics,
technology community, the knowledge management community. Any other? Okay, so we've got a range of different sectors. That's really good. Those different perspectives will be important. We also want to think about the roles you play with respect to data. So if we've got people in the room who see their role as being data providers, they publish and create data for other people to use. Just a few. No, more people finding they have a data providing role. That's great. What about policymakers who set the frameworks within which data is provided? Great. We've got some policymakers as well. Data users who spend most of their time using data that others have produced. Next again, and intermediaries, people who see their role as building technologies or providing tools that help others make use of data. A good group of intermediaries. So, we want you to bring those different perspectives to our groups in a moment. Now, I'm going to ask our facilitators to go and stand by the tables they're going to be facilitating at. And they're going to make a pitch for you to come and join them and bring your perspectives to the workshop session that they'll facilitate around the tables. The 6 tables here will be looking at the ag sector package that Andre spoke about. The 3 tables over here will be looking at the initiative for open ag funding, specifically about data on agricultural investment data. So, I'll come over to Fiona first. Who do you want at your table, Fiona?
So I'm looking to attract some policymakers in the room, or also perhaps some data providers. So if you fall into either of those categories, come to my table.
Hi, I'm Anna, and I'm looking to attract any technology, standards, in-betweeners, and intermediaries.
I'm looking for people who are interested in the end users of data.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to meet with policymakers and data providers.
I'm also looking for technical people.
And then Fatma's going to be on the table here. Sorry, there you go. Do you want to come to this table?
Yes,
Yep.
okay. And I'm looking for NGOs and users.
Fantastic. So, if you're interested in the ag sector package, hopefully you've seen some way you can have a perspective there. We're going to come over to the open ag funding. Who's here?
If you're with civil society or academia, feel free to join us at this table.
Hi, if you're from the private sector, you can come to the table here, please.
So I guess I'm everybody else. I'm looking for nice people from government or publishers of data who want to talk about the open ag funding project.
Okay, so you have your choice to make. Choose which table you'd like to join. Go and join that table, and then just spend 5 minutes introducing yourself to others on that table. Who are you? Where are you from? What brought you to that table? No longer stories. Come on.
Great to see you.
Yes. How are you? Hi. So,
I tweeted you.
ah, yes, I saw you.
But I think I'll go with the standard people.